first met James through a mutual friend. I had been working at our local newspaper in Port Townsend, Washington, the leader, and was kind of ready for something new, and did a story about, had written a story about a woman who wrote for soap operas in New York, Gillian Spencer. And after interviewing her, I asked her at the end of the interview, do you ever have any extra work? Is there anything that I could ever help you with? I would love to do that. And she said, well, no, but I do have this friend who is becoming, who can't see as well as he used to, and he's kind of looking for some help, and he might like to meet you. So that's how I met James, because she connected us together. And what did I think of James? James was a wizened little man who wore wonderful hats and had a twinkle in his eye all the time. And I think that was probably one thing that drew me to him right off the bat. He was warm and genuine, and I could tell right away that he would be somebody that I could work with very easily. James called me his amanuensis, not a secretary. I loved that word. It was a much more personal, endearing word than secretary, and I cherish that he thought of me that way. I helped James. I helped be his eyes. His eyesight was failing by 1990 when I first met him, and there was nothing wrong with his mind or his creative process, but his body was starting to give out on him, and so he needed some help getting all of those ideas on paper. And so he would have all kinds of ideas that I would sometimes take dictation, and in his office sometimes he would come prepared with papers that he had written, typewritten, and then made lots of little notes on, and edits and revisions. And these were things that he had brewing in his head, and had sometimes put them down and sometimes not. So we did a combination process of dictation and reviewing what he had written, and making notes on that, revisions, edits, that sort of thing. It was eye-opening for me because I came from a journalism background, and in journalism you barely have time to do one draft, maybe two if you're lucky, or maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs of a story you get to rewrite, but you don't get to rewrite the whole thing. That's a luxury. So what I learned from James, a great deal of what I learned from him, was about revision, rewrites, polishing, finding the exact word, the precise word to tell, to convey the exact meaning of a thought, of a feeling. I was at first. I was a fairly naive young mother who grew up in a small town, and didn't have a lot of these kinds of experiences that James talks about in his books. So I was a little shocked at first, but I kept that under wraps. I said, I can handle this, no problem. And it wasn't so shocking. It all came from a place of love and joy, and so I got over that shock pretty easily, pretty quickly. I remember very well the poem a very lyrical poem, Nipples and Cocks, for instance. And that one kind of, it was kind of a sing-songy kind of poem. And I thought, this is really funny, but this is like nothing I've ever heard before. It didn't discourage me from working with him at all. It was, I felt like I knew his heart right away, and it was playful and real, and I appreciate a good giggle. I did not, no. I did not. I would work with James in his office in downtown Port Townsend. He had a great office on an upper level in one of the old historic buildings downtown. And I would meet with him at 10 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings. We worked for a good couple of hours every Tuesday and Thursday. And he would review with me perhaps work that he had started at home, that he'd been ruminating about, and then we would go over it as thoroughly as we could. And my task would be to come back and with something typed up for him in a more readable form, rather than lots of chicken scratches, which, like that. And his writing got tinier and tinier as the years went on. I did notice a difference, certainly, after James's stroke. As far as his own writing, it was more difficult to decipher what he had on the printed page. It did get very tiny. But we would go over it all, so I was clear about what was on the page. This is an example of some of how tiny his writing became after his stroke. He just didn't have much movement in his hands by that time. The ideas were still all there, and he just needed some help getting them out. So I felt like I could help him with that, and was grateful to do so. Occasionally, he was exceptionally talented at wordsmithing himself, so I couldn't provide much help with that. But I enjoyed the process with working with James and developing the most precise word, or discovering that exact word to convey the meaning that he really wanted to get across. He enjoyed thesauruses, for instance, and I always had too. I love thesauruses, and we found that we would look up words together and say, he would say, well, look up that word and let's see if we can find a better one, or what did you find? And so we would discover that together sometimes. He loved words about joy, about bliss. He loved synonyms that would stand in for those words. He loved the play of language in his poetry and his films. That's very evident. He would constantly search for the absolute best word. If he wasn't working on a new book project, he had correspondence that he needed my help with. There was always some little project, like perhaps a foreword to another book, or an interview, even something like that he needed typed up. So we would constantly be working on things like that, but always there was the poetry. There was that we always came back to that. I sat with him and we went over his work together, and then I would go home and type things up and bring them back to him. Surely, I have some wonderful inscriptions on the books that we worked on together, and we worked on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books, I believe, together. One of my favorites, although not the first, is his memoir, Coming Unbuttoned. And I love what he wrote to me here. He says, "For my precious Lynn, the faithful dragnet of my past, with love and gratitude." That's what I mean about the precise word. He found that word, dragnet. In making light of it, James has a very nice inscription to me: "For Lynn, without whom this book would never have seen the light. With love, from James." This was a book of prose. Yes, it was, and it was not his favorite form. Poetry was certainly his first love, the place where he felt the most comfortable. But he's an excellent writer of prose. No doubt about it. I was in awe. But he, as with his poetry, he rewrote constantly, many different revisions, and I typed them all for him gladly. He did do considerable rewrite of this book. Here's an example of something that he had typed and brought to me, and then we worked on finding the right word. "Once I could foam at the poetic mouth with a tumble of words and rumble of thought, but lately my tongue is tied up in knots and it won't stick far out, however I push. Does the mind start to rot as the flesh decays? Is a tombstone carved? Is my shroud laid out? I still hoard blueprints for a warrior city. I still uphold tablets of revelation. But I've lost my builders, my machinery rusts, lost the voices of rally and recruit. A city of jocundity still lights up my dream, but how can I wise it? How can I wise it into a wide open house?" Yes, he loved to play with that. He loved to play with words, especially verbs. "Does the mind start to rot as the flesh degenerates?" That was his first draft, but he changed that to "Does the mind start to rot as the flesh decays?" ? And later on he says, originally, "A city of jocundity still rises in my dream, but how can I raise it to an open house?" But he's changed it to, "A city of jocundity still lights up my dream, but how can I wise it into a wide open house?" ? That was very typical, just playing around with the words until it was just right. And interestingly, I think at one time, that poem would have been perfect as it is, but he loved to rework his own compositions. And later on, it wasn't perfect anymore, and he needed to adjust it, and he would do that quite frequently. He did that a lot for the book Packing Up for Paradise. He took a lot of older poems and reworked them extensively. The Androgyne Journal and Making Light of It were both revisions of earlier drafts, so he reworked this one considerably. And these were the first 2 books that I worked with him on. As one of the first introductions to James, the Androgyne Journal was a little shocking. We were simultaneously working on his memoirs, at that time, but we would work a little bit on Androgyne Journal and a little bit on his autobiography. So the Androgyne Journal was not within my realm of experience, but I really feel that James broadened my own understanding of a lot of things, and I welcomed learning. We did sometimes talk about my discomfort. I think he sensed it. I never told him that I was uncomfortable. I've just wanted to be professional, so I never told him that. I think he could probably sense that. He knew enough about my background that I was probably not as familiar with this kind of literature. But he said, now this might be a little shocking, or I think it was not an issue. We worked through it. I didn't let it make it. I didn't let it be an issue. James loved the acceptance and of Port Townsend, the community of Port Townsend, and the quirkiness of Port Townsend, and the possibilities that Port Townsend allowed him. I think he felt that he certainly could. It was a place where he could certainly be himself and continue his writing, continue to make his art. As far as what the town thought of him, I certainly a degree of the population knew of him. I wish more people had. Port Townsend didn't think of James as an eccentric old egotist. Eccentric maybe, yes, but egotist, not necessarily. Just someone who marched to his own drummer, and who doesn't in Port Townsend. Follow your own weird. James's weird was that he was unafraid to express himself exactly the way he needed to from within, from the way his angel told him to express himself, which might have included explorations, as in the Androgyne Journal, for example, which were very personal and very explicit. I didn't get to see it that often, except later on, of course. When I came to the house, I became more aware of their routines and felt honored to be welcomed into their home and into that intimate part of their lives and their relationship. And what I saw was a remarkable relationship between two people who loved each other. He really did. He really did. He really did right up right to the end. James did not shy away from death. Death was something he thought about a lot. He wrote about it and had been writing about it far sooner than the few years before his actual death. It shows up in poems, it shows up in films. He welcomed death in a lot of ways. It wasn't something that he was afraid of. I was very grateful to be part of that process of watching James ease out of this world. Our relationship definitely changed over the 9 years that I worked with him. At first, it was strictly a professional relationship, although we quickly became friends. But as he became weaker in the last couple of years of his life, I was happy to help give Joel a break sometimes in the caregiving, and when I would go out to his house, I would be the one to help James attend to his physical needs as well. One of James's favorite quotes that I still admire and use in my daily life is "Adventure, not predicament." And I think very fondly of James and try to emulate that policy, that ideal in my own life. He was a dear man. He was a lovely man who always appreciated anything I did for him. I often say it was the best job I ever had, because I would go to work with him, and he was so lovely and so accepting of me, interested in me, he would love to have a conversation first before we began our work, and that was refreshing to me, and meaningful. We quickly became friends as well as coworkers. He would hold my hand and tell me I was dear and that he loved me, and what's not to love about that? That was pretty wonderful. Pretty wonderful. I would have to say that if he walked into the room right now, the energy would emanate from his eyes. That's the first memory that when I'm recalling James, that's what I would notice first. His eyes always had a twinkle and a joyousness about them, and you could see his soul when you looked into his eyes. I have a couple of favorites from Little Sermons of the Big Joy, a tiny little book that's perhaps one of my favorites of all of James's books. I have them marked. They also appear, some of his poems in Little Sermons of the Big Joy appear in Packing Up for Paradise. I think maybe all of them do. Shake out your qualms, shake up your dreams. Don't loll in the damp. Set fire to yourself. Set fire to your hope of cornucopias. To please the gods, replant the planet. Committees never produce a masterpiece. Only the oddball runs with a vision. Quit your addiction to sneer and complaint. Try a little flaunt. Call for comrades who bolster your vim and offer you risk. Corral the crones, goose the nice Nellies, hunt the bear that hugs and the raven that quoths. Stay up all night to devise a new dawn. Here's another. Take the whole kit with the caboodle. Experience life, don't deplore it. Shake hands with time, don't kill it. Open a lookout, dance on a brink. Run with your wildfire. You are closer to glory leaping an abyss than upholstering a rut. This one is, the last line is something that he inscribed to me in my copy of Little Sermons. And he knew that it applied to me, and so I cherish this one. Outwit the vultures. Attach your wings to the larks of dawn. Maybe you will hear old Adam singing of earthly sport and heavenly chores. To serve the angels, establish your Eden in the crux of the world. Love lies dreaming in the duties of the day. James Broughton was Big Joy. James Broughton was a teacher of love and bliss and glory. James Broughton was meaningful to me in my life. He taught me so much about the world, about love. James Broughton broadened my horizons. James Broughton loved the dance of life. James Broughton loved a good giggle and did that frequently. James Broughton was a lovely man whom I admired greatly. I would want to say, I love you, James. I've learned so much from you. You enriched my life in great measure, and I will remember the lessons you taught me for the rest of my life. And I thank you.